This episode of the EV Resource Podcast is brought to you by Titan Auto and Tire. Titan has some of the very few independent auto repair shops in Central Virginia that are qualified to work on EVs and hybrids. And from hybrids to Hummers, they fix everything. For more information and to schedule an appointment for your vehicle, go to TitanAutoTire.com. Coming up this week.
This is a growing pain issue.
Okay.
So where do you put the solar panels? Where do you put the windmills? You put the windmills where it's windy. Well, that's up in the panhandle area of Texas. Now they're building out in other places now, particularly along the south. But then, there's no people up there. So you got to transmit that power from that area to the population centers, which are all in the east.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 162 of the EV Resource Podcast. I'm Zach Hurst, and each week I bring you the latest EV news, information, and interviews with industry experts. Well, coming up this episode, I am joined by Kevin Green. He's a professor of physics at the University of New Haven. And what we're going to be talking about is the grid on a national scale, as well as some smaller parts, but really addressing the concern that apparently some people have that the grid in the United States just can't handle all of the electric vehicles that are going to be on the roads in the coming years. So I want to welcome Kevin to the EV Resource Podcast. Kevin, thank you so much for your time and being willing to share your expertise. Before we really dive in, I definitely want to give you a chance to give some of your background and share with us where you're coming from and why you're a good person to talk to about this.
All right. Thanks, Zach, very much. So yes, I was trained in physics and did research for a while, but then shifted over into the energy sector after a few years in physics and worked there for about 15 years. Part of that was on my own. Since then, I've come back to teaching, but I've had a lot of exposure to electricity markets, nat gas markets, things like that, just dealing with supply, demand, those types of issues and what drives those two things. And so recently in the last 2 years, I've been, it was really the big storm in Texas that got me back into this. Winter Storm Uri and Uri in February of 21. And, part of the grid went down there. And so I just thought, well, maybe it's time to jump back in and see if I can add some value in this particular area.
What you're talking about specifically, you have a daily report newsletter that goes out talking about the grid in Texas. That going down, that was a really, really significant issue. That was a big deal. And it certainly made the news on a global scale.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So first off, my daily update, it's on Substack. So I write at the address Impedance Match on Substack.com, and Impedance Match, to give you an idea of what that means, it's basically in communication. When you're talking about electrical communication over wires or such, you have to have the impedance, or what you could call it, the resistance of the cables match your circuitry, and if it doesn't match, then you get all sorts of crosstalk and a bunch of nonsense. It's hard, a lot of noise. And so that was the genesis of the name. And so what I wanted, the goal was and still is to try and bring accurate information to people about not just ERCOT, but the rest of the nation. And I've been concentrating on ERCOT, and I just keep diving in and turning over rocks, and it's a great little place to look around. So that's why it's primarily just an ERCOT information. At some point, hopefully by the end of the summer, I'm going to be branching out here into other areas of the country. But feel free to ask me about other areas of the country, not just ERCOT.
Well, and that's fine. ERCOT in Texas certainly is a very fascinating situation, because that Texas, for people who don't know, the national grid in the United States is separated into mostly three major areas. You've got the East, the West, and Texas. And Texas is kind of on its own because they, for political reasons or policy, they don't want to be connected with the rest of the country. There's not really any interconnection between ERCOT and the Texas grid and the rest of the country. One thing that I've found really interesting, Kevin, is that Texas is actually a leader in renewable energy, wind and solar, but yet there's so many issues that come up with the grid there because they have to actually curtail generation because they don't have the ability to transmit that electrical energy to other places that might need it.
That's correct. Yes, it's an interesting. They have interesting growing pains. I think that's the way to say it. Is they've been growing by leaps and bounds on both the supply side and also in terms of renewable generation and but also on the demand side. Loads are going up there, and there's some cross between the two, which is really interesting, which we could get into.
Naturally, I definitely want to tie the electric vehicle side into things. So I want to ask you, I mean, if we're looking at the grid, and I'm going to back out and just kind of be very generic about this, but if we're looking at the grid from a 10,000 foot level, electric vehicles do require a lot of energy to drive compared to any other appliance. And I'm going to use the word appliance because that's the best I can pull from. But your HVAC system in your home or your electric range, they don't use anywhere near the amount of electricity that an electric car would. There's maybe some merit to the argument that, if we all were driving electric cars, the grid could not handle it. But I've found that there's lots of different ways that electric vehicles and then just batteries in general can help the grid. I was hoping that maybe you could speak to that point and share in your experience and what you're seeing actually play out in this country, how EVs are actually helping the grid in many different ways.
Yes. Okay. Well, I can certainly try to do that. So the first thing that's worth pointing out is that electric vehicles at the moment are a very, very small part of the grid presently. It's just a very small part. Now that should grow with time, but you've got to, it's going to take a while. It's got to take a while. I can tell you why it will take a while. I mean, there are two things. So you're going to know this number. What is the, how many vehicles that are sold today are electric?
Oh, well, it's more than it was, thankfully. But still, I think across the country, it's around 2% of the vehicles on the road are electric.
2%.
And I believe, and I would have to double check the math, but I think the number of new vehicles that are sold that are electric is upwards of like 5 or 6%. The majority of that being entirely in California. I mean, 10% of new vehicles sold, I believe, in California are electric. So it's definitely very concentrated into that one state.
Does the 2% value that you have, does that include the hybrids?
I will have to actually go back and double check, but plug-in hybrids compared to full battery electric vehicles are very different when it comes to the total amount of electricity they're going to need. Their batteries are very, very small.
So then the question is, well, what would happen if we started to replacing some of these older vehicles with EVs? The average car is lasting over 12 years now, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? So, it's less than 10% of the vehicles are turned over every year.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. The existing fleet is going to be on the road for a good part of the foreseeable future.
Yes. So I think what that tells us is that the gasoline's not going away anytime, at least not very quickly. That could change. Now I can tell you how that could change because people will vote with their pocketbook, and if the prices of these EVs come down dramatically, then we could actually see a huge surge. But that's not necessarily in the cards today. So I think presently at the current rates, there isn't a problem absorbing vehicles, and then we could grow that with time. Now, if we were to take, the numbers that I have are from Texas, from the ERCOT system, and the question is, well, how much more would electricity usage have to go up to replace all the cars, if you will? and most of the transportation sector. And the answer is really between 20 and 30%. It's not all that much. So you could grow that at if we're only growing at a few percent a year, that's not going to be that difficult to provide, I don't think.
Sure. So I'm going to play devil's advocate and actually take a position that is contrary to the way I typically approach this.
Sure. Let's do it.
Naturally, I am biased for electric vehicles. I mean, that's my passion. I believe that they are the best form of transportation going forwards. However, I'm going to try to channel some of the critics and the way they think and the things that they say here for a minute. Peak demand at certain times of the day, especially in the summertime when, everybody's running their air conditioning units. If we're plugging EVs in, there are certainly examples, and we can look into California at times where they have rolling brownouts that are on purpose. It's not like they're just waiting around for something to happen and they're going, oops. They're specifically turning on and off electrical supply to various areas based on the situation. And the understanding that a lot of people get, because EV owners are told do not charge your cars, is that is putting too much strain on the grid. One thing that occurs to me, and then maybe you can touch on this, is that the grid as a whole certainly could handle it. I mean, there's enough generation, but it's when you get down to the smaller veins of transmission lines in neighborhoods where the transformers might not be upgraded. I mean, is there any issue really there, that the electric vehicles are kind of causing too much strain? Or is that easy to solve just by saying, hey, charge overnight like you would anyway on off-peak times?
Well, the troubles that you're talking about in California, this is primarily from last year, if I'm not mistaken. Hydro was way down last year. That's one thing to point out, and it's hard to gauge, how that will go in the future. Of course, in the risk scenario, you have to assume that the hydro won't necessarily be there. There is that, but you've pointed it out, I think, already here. It's a timing issue. It's a timing issue. If you think about what your vehicle is doing, 90% of the time, it's just sitting there, right? It's not being used, and so for the vast majority of the applications, you're talking about this not being a problem if you don't charge your electric vehicle for in that particular moment. Now, there's another issue that's related to that, which it has to do with how electricity pricing is done, and if you go to the larger scale, you find that there is more real-time pricing options available to you, but you do not see this at the retail scale, really.
Okay.
So if it would be great to have, if you had something on your phone that said, if I run my dryer right now, it's going to charge me $1 a kilowatt hour or something like that. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
There's no real-time pricing mechanism at the moment. You're paying the whatever costs it is per kilowatt hour that you're going to purchase there, and it doesn't matter if the wholesale market's at 2 cents a kilowatt hour or at $2 a kilowatt hour.
Okay. Sure.
So if you look at the times when these situations occur, it's a very small sliver of what's actually happening. The opportunity that it presents itself in this situation is that if you were to just increase, say, the storage prior to these episodes, which are now completely predictable 3, 4, sometimes 10 days in advance, then you can prepare yourself for these types of situations. So I think it's more of a market inefficiency more than it is a structural, and because of the market inefficiency, there are structural barriers, but they don't have to be there. They do not have to be there.
In many ways, having more storage will help not only flatten the curve, but the peak rate.
Absolutely. Yes.
But then the storage. So I mean, storage obviously helps when you're looking at somebody that has storage at their home, or now with a lot of electric vehicles having vehicle to grid home other vehicles, the ability to give power.
Yes, absolutely. So you could, in principle, you could use your vehicle as a storage that could help manage the power in your home, for instance.
So does that make an effect larger than just for that person at their home? Like, does that have kind of a butterfly effect, if you will, and benefit the neighborhood or the city or the grid as a whole, if more and more people are starting to do that?
Oh, absolutely. So if you can, if we had the ability to do real time pricing, and we had a way of pushing that down to the consumer level, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a conscious decision, although you would kind of want it to be, because these episodes, a lot of these episodes are very short-lived. They're, the longest types of episodes are a few days in length.
Okay.
Which is what happened in ERCOT when the winter storm came in, and it was a few days that were really, really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the longest part of the normally would think about. You could think of maybe even worse disasters, I suppose. But at the moment, I would say that's probably at a few days of where you have these really large extremes.
Sure.
And so, in fact, that would be a very wonderful way to fix this problem, because in a place like ERCOT, even in California, the wind generally peaks in the spring.
Okay.
And demand peaks in the summer. There's a winter peak also, but it's usually a summer peak, right? So now that's a hard problem, trying to get store the energy in the spring and then use it in the summer. That is in essence what we do with the hydro, if you will, in some of these big dams. But to think about doing that with batteries, it's a tough sell.
I mean, batteries are definitely good for storing energy. Maybe like you were saying, over the course of a few days or a week. Beyond that, I imagine we'd have to look at other methods like pumped hydro, or even gravity.
Would be a good one. Yes, there's
gravity batteries or something like that.
There are other possible, or there are other ideas. However, that's kind of a longer term problem. Let's just go to let's go to ERCOT, because this is what I know better.
Yeah.
In the spring, what's also good is the solar. The solar has a similar thing. The solar peaks in June, May, June, and then it's downhill until December, Jan. Late Dec, early Jan is when it's kind of at its bottom.
Sure.
And so there's that. So June's a little closer than, say, March is in terms of servicing August there. But still, you still need some sort of long-term thing. However, on the shorter term, even on a daily basis, there are times in Texas where you have more power coming from solar and or wind, usually one or the other. At night it's the wind, and the daytime it's the solar. And then in the springtime, there's this funny thing that happens, that the sun goes down, the demand is near its peak because it's in the evening hours, and you don't have the long summer days quite yet. Makes sense.
Sure.
And so you can get this cheap pricing for power on the wholesale level for most of the day, and actually a good deal of the night. And then right in the evening, there's going to be this little 2-3 hour period where the prices can spike because the solar's going down, the wind hasn't picked back up, and everybody's home and they've got their
Oh yeah.
Texas. So there's still a little bit of air conditioning, and businesses are shutting down.
I've seen in some of the reports that you've put out have actually shown that the wholesale price has gone negative.
Yes, this is the case in Texas. Now, so there are some structural reasons for that are worth pointing out. And again, this is a growing pain issue.
Okay.
So where do you put the solar panels? Where do you put the windmills? You put the windmills where it's windy. Well, that's up in the Panhandle area of Texas.
Uh-huh.
Now they're building out in other places now, particularly along the south. But then there's no people up there, so you got to transmit that power from that area to the population centers, which are all in the east. The northeast, southeast. So Dallas is in the northeast. South Central is going to be Austin and San Antonio, and then there's Houston in the southeast. So that's where most of the people are, but the power's up in the Panhandle.
Right.
That's when, there's more. There's so much wind was built out that there's more wind generated than can be transmitted on the transmission lines to the east. Now, for the record, I want to point out here, so the people responsible for a lot of that, and this is very surprising to a lot of people, are Governor Bush and Governor Perry.
Okay.
So they were both of those guys were big in helping generate this situation
with the more of the renewable energy, with the renewable,
with the wind. So Bush was a big with renewables, with wind, and Perry was, I think, around when a lot of the transmission lines were in.
Okay, so we're not relying only on wind. And certainly, a lot of EV owners actually think about solar and putting solar on their roof. I have previously talked with Big Sun Solar, which is a community solar program where they're putting solar panels up, and then individual people can purchase a panel or multiple panels that is not even on their home, but they're still benefiting from their investment into growing the solar. Is that something where having more of distributed generation, assets that are where the people are, is that something that would help with some of the current limitations of the transmission lines?
Well, that would certainly help. That can certainly help. The reason why the wind was built where it was because that's where the wind was, and then also the solar. Most of you have fewer cloudy days in West Texas than you do in East Texas, because in East Texas you get the influence of the Gulf coming up.
So, okay, sure.
And if you just run the numbers, and if you want to maximize your generation output, you want to put it in West Texas. So that's, I think, in the first wave, that's what happened.
Okay.
That's what happened. I think people are starting to feel the consequences now, and this thing here will be, I think, another effect, that an unintended consequence that is a little surprising. So now, what do you have? You have in West Texas, you have these times when you have power prices going negative because there's too much power, either wind or solar. And so, you as a business person, you look at that and what do you say? Hey, I want to build in West Texas. So if you look at where most of the load growth has been in Texas, it's been in West Texas.
Okay.
West Texas and North Texas, up near the Panhandle. And so, you're seeing, and it's just part of the growing pains, right? Now, we could talk about what some of that demand is, which is kind of funny, and another unintended consequence, because a lot of it has to do with Bitcoin mining and other of these.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Fascinating.
And so, I'm not sure how I feel exactly about the subsidies for solar and wind generation going into the manufacturing of these electronic
Oh, that is quite fascinating. But I mean, it makes a lot
It
of
makes
sense
perfect
that,
sense, does it not?
yeah.
And it's not, so the expansion's going on in the western part of the state, and that will take up some of that excess demand. The other thing that's happening is you're now beginning to see battery uh, storage build out, which you did not see before, and you didn't see it before because, well, you weren't getting these at least long episodes of negative pricing periods. You'd get some short ones, and again, you mainly get it in the spring and the fall. But when the load is down because it's not
Uh-huh.
so hot anymore, it's not so cold. So you're starting to see a build out of the storage capacity, which is going to make a big effect. And so getting back, you asked the question earlier about, is it going to help if you have this capability? And the answer is yes. So you take that again, you take that period in the evening where the solar's down and the wind isn't up yet, and you still have this high load. You put in 3 hours of capacity. Does that make sense? 3 hours
Yes.
of duration of capacity, and then you just smooth that out. And when you smooth that out, all of a sudden, that's cheap. That's cheap power because it costs you nothing to generate it, right?
Right.
The marginal price is basically, because of the subsidy, is actually negative. But with the batteries, so the battery packs are going in now, and if you'll smooth that out, and then what's that going to do? That's going to take the price down in that evening peak.
Right. Right.
And so the same thing can happen on these really extreme days if you have more of the storage available, because it costs you it costs, on a marginal basis, it doesn't really cost you to store the power if you're using the renewables to do it, and then you can sell it at whatever the market price is during these extreme events.
Do you think that is what ERCOT really needs to focus on? I mean, it sounds like that's one solution. The other solution that to me seems fairly obvious is to build more transmission lines. But that in of itself, I would imagine, can get very expensive.
That's always the key issue: is does it make sense? Is it economically viable to build the transmission lines? And I haven't run those numbers, but they're not going to be built unless there's a profit incentive involved there, if that makes sense. And I think within the last year or so, you're seeing enough of the signaling of the negative pricing that I'm sure people are looking at it. But I haven't seen people come out with bigger proposals. I think with big proposals of extending the transmission. I think what you're seeing is the opposite thing. People are moving their whatever business they can into those areas. Number one, and number two, the generators are adding battery capacity to increase the amount of storage, which they can then sell at a later time at a profit. So
Sure.
that's what's happening.
So if we again kind of step out of Texas and look at the grid as a whole, those issues that Texas has in terms of the generation and the usage of the electricity are in vastly different geographic areas. The grid as a whole, does that have a similar issue in terms of one part of the country to the other? I mean, there's a lot more interconnection, so that I would imagine makes that a little bit easier to deal with. But are you seeing a lot of similar concerns?
Well, you're seeing it all over. You're seeing it so for instance, California last year is a big issue. Now, I get it's not just the lack of hydro; it's the high temperatures, and then the fire concerns. The fire and dealing with the fire concerns. These are going to take some time to work out, but again, I think they're if you don't want to call them growing pains, you can call them transition pains as we move to this other area. But there's nothing necessarily restricting the renewables from coming in. Not in my mind. The biggest restriction, I think, is the lack of the lack of cheap batteries. If the battery price could come down, it's the same thing with the electric vehicles, right?
Yeah, the battery's the most expensive part.
We
Yep.
need a very large source of lithium. But and again, that's going to be an economy of scale issue. But I think you're seeing people ramp up on that too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's all just kind of transition pains or growing pains. If you go to the East Coast, so I'm up here in New England.
Yeah.
And New England's had some serious issues. So the people up here, there's a real, we could call it a NIMBY phenomenon here, or even what do they call it? Banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So that's banana. And you see this in the up here in New England and also New York. They're separate systems, but they're with some ties between them. And so when the nat gas, when the fracking came in with the shale, they there was a lot of opposition to having that gas move east. So instead, it's gone west. But it's not like it stayed in the ground. It's
right.
It's now moving west and south. But so it's instead of coming east, there are certain restrictions. So here's another situation that's related to that, which is in the Northeast, particularly Boston and the bigger metropolitan areas. In the winter, when it gets really cold, there's now not enough generation capacity. There is enough generation capacity. There's not enough gas transmission capacity to presently meet demand. So what do? LNG tankers come in, and so you're taking LNG from the Gulf Coast area and you're bringing it up to the Boston area.
Oh my goodness.
To meet the demand on those really cold days.
That's causing me to squirm a little bit in my seat because it's just,
well, a little bit, but and it was a decision that was made.
Like, I'm like thinking about all of the costs. There's nothing efficient about that model.
There's nothing efficient about that model, no.
Cost wise, but then just emissions wise. I mean, you've got these trucks that makes my heart hurt a little bit. What how do we even begin to solve that?
So how do you fix that? Okay, so storage could go a long way, but it's not 2-hour storage. It's more like a week storage, if you will, or 3-4 day storage. And then you need a mechanism, presumably a price mechanism that incents people to put the energy into storage, forecasting out in the future to when the demand is actually going to be needed. So that currently is missing from the market. Now, in terms of the East, there are some things that have been in the works. One is wind along the East Coast, because there's a very large East Coast there, and across the East Coast, you could conceive of a huge amount of wind generation going in. I think the economics aren't quite there for the battery storage to help with that. Again, to make that work now, a company like Tesla may be able to make that work, or some of the other Sunrun, I think, is a company that tries to do something similar. They may
Sunrun's working with Ford, actually, with the F-150 Lightning, to be able to use the battery packs in the trucks as basically, a grid tied battery storage, essentially.
Well, wouldn't that be a kind of a cool thing to have happen? I mean, even today, even with these internal combustion engines, what's a generator? Well, it's an internal combustion engine, most of them, right?
Right, yeah.
So you would think that there would be a way that you could hook your car, if the power goes out, you could hook your car up to your home and help power your home. And, the utilities have sort of resisted that. So, there's a whole bunch of possible ways to fix the extreme. There's a whole bunch of ways that could work. It's just, it's a question of, the regulatory concerns or safety concerns. I don't see it much worse than, people, when ERCOT February 21, people were dying from carbon monoxide poisoning because why? Well, they had, they needed a heater in their house, and it's just so there's people are dying now, so it's not like there isn't this, the safety issue it's a concern, but that shouldn't be the thing that stops it. Having looked at a lot of these technologies, the pricing isn't quite there on a lot of it, but a lot of it's also regulatory and just market structure. And if we could work on that, then all of these or most of these really big concerns, I think, could be tossed out the window. So it's an opportunity. Zach, it's what it is. It's an opportunity. So people, I've noticed this having looked at a lot of this stuff now for the last 2 decades or so. And it's just, there are people who say, well, it's not going to work. It's never going to work, et cetera, et cetera. Or there are people that say, well, now here's an opportunity to try and make this work better. And it's the people who see the opportunity that are the ones getting things done. And
well, those who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those who are already doing it.
Who are already doing it. I like that phrase. Yes.
Well, Kevin, I mean, I know we said we wanted to keep things to roughly a half hour. We have covered a lot. So I just want to thank you for coming on. And certainly I welcome anybody in the audience to submit questions that they might have about this conversation or anything else to hello@ev-resource.com. And then I will make sure to forward those questions to you, Kevin. Or honestly, if we get enough, then I would welcome you back. And then maybe we could actually have an episode where we just answer specific questions that people have about, variety of things.
We could go around the U.S. and talk about the different places and the problems they're facing. I mean, there's all sorts of things we can do here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, that all sounds like so much fun to me. So
yes. Sounds good to me, too. All right,
awesome.
Zach. It's been a pleasure.
All right, so there you go. I hope that was beneficial for all of you. I know I was able to pull a lot of new information from Kevin and really just appreciate all of the experience and knowledge that he has, that he was willing to share with us. I have been following Kevin's daily updates on ERCOT for a while, and these are not high-level summaries. These daily reports are extremely detailed, and it really gives readers so much information about what's going on. If you're even remotely curious, I've got the link to that report in the show notes and would strongly recommend that you consider subscribing to it. On now to the question of the week. I had asked you all on last episode if you'd consider buying an EV from a Chinese brand, and I have to admit that I was expecting the majority of the responses to say no. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong with my expectations. An astounding 80% of you responded that you would indeed consider buying an electric vehicle from a Chinese manufacturer like XPeng, NIO, BYD, or others. And Andy Cooper mentioned the brand Zeekr. He said, quote, "I would jump on a Zeekr 001 faster than its 0 to 60 time. Ultimately, it would be a value decision based on my aesthetic taste, personal priorities, and assurance of maintenance if something goes wrong. As I understand, Chinese brands put a lot of focus on software, similar to Tesla. This is something that traditional brands need to embrace. From personal experience, there are a whole lot of small tweaks that would make my Genesis just fantastic, but they, and Hyundai Motor Group as a whole, are not paying attention to the community. That's going to be a serious consideration in my next car," end quote. And Andy mentioned something there that was actually the big reason why I wouldn't consider a Chinese EV at this time, and that's service, or that I just don't know how it would go. If nothing ever goes wrong with a car, then I'm sure I'd consider just about any vehicle that fit my personal likes and needs. However, I've learned that as a result of owning a Tesla, parts availability and generally service when something does go wrong is very important. Not that Tesla has done anything wrong. I mean, they've actually done a really good job for us, but it is something that has put it in my mind when considering other options. So thank you to everyone who participated this past week. For this episode's question of the week, it's actually going to be interesting. I look at the download numbers for this podcast, and one thing I've always been amazed with is how diverse you all are based on geography. Just the last episode alone, for example, was downloaded in 334 different cities in 33 different countries across 5 continents. This is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And naturally, the majority, in this case 79%, is from here in North America, but 10% is from Europe, 4% from Asia and Australia each, and even 1% from Africa. So I think this is really cool, actually. And I want to ask all of you that don't live in North America, or those that do. I mean, if you live in North America, it's fine. You can participate too. I'm not saying you can't, but I specifically want to reach out to those of you who do not live in North America. And I want to encourage you to let me know what country you're from and something about yourself that you would want me to know. And we don't even have to use Patreon for this, as I recognize that some of you might want to keep your answers private. I will have the poll on Patreon anyway, the way I always do. It'll be pinned to the top, available for everybody to participate with. You don't have to be a subscriber on Patreon in order to participate. But if you don't want the world to see what your answer would be, feel free to send me an email to hello@ev-resource.com. And if you don't want me to specifically share anything about it, then just write that and let me know that you'd like to stay anonymous, or just not have me share your answer at all. I just really want to get to know all of you a little bit better. And in case you're curious, the top 5 cities from the last episode in terms of downloads were Los Angeles, California, Chicago, Illinois, Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix, Arizona, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the next one, number 6, is the first city outside of North America, and that was Sydney, Australia. The top 5 countries where the last podcast episode was downloaded were the USA, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Vietnam. And if you didn't hear your city or country in those lists, well, tell all of your friends to listen to the podcast too, and then we can get a healthy competition going to see who can dethrone the leaders. Anyway, I get a kick out of looking at all these numbers because these numbers represent you, real people who give your time to listen to me. So I am truly grateful to all of you because time is the most valuable resource we have. Once we spend it, we don't get it back. And so the fact that you're choosing to listen to me is actually very humbling, and I am so grateful and appreciative of that. I also want to thank those of you who are giving of your money and resources as well. There are a few fine individuals that have chosen to support my efforts with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. And if you don't know, Patreon is a platform that allows listeners of this podcast to choose to give as little as $1 a month to show their appreciation for the hard work that I put into producing not only this podcast, but also the videos and magazine, newsletter, and whatnot. And while it's not much on an individual basis, it does add up, and together as a group makes a noticeable difference in what I'm able to do with EV Resource. After all, the podcast hosting, website and domain hosting, various software and other equipment, it's not free. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to do this if I had to come out of pocket for this every month. So let me get on to not only thanking all of you for listening, but also to thanking the Patreon supporters. At the director tier, the top tier, we've got Rajiv Narayan, Andy Cooper, and Ethan B. And at the executive producer tier is Christopher Lawrence. And if you'd like to show your support, but maybe Patreon isn't your cup of tea, I do also have a number of affiliate connections that have partnered with EV Resource, where if you purchase one of their products through the links that I've provided on the webpage, they give a little back to me to help as well. It's kind of an indirect way to show your support. And honestly, if you're going to purchase some of these things anyway, why not do it through the referral links? I actually want to start shining a spotlight on an affiliate in each episode. And this episode, I want to mention OtterBox. Now, you may already know that OtterBox is a leader in protecting mobile devices with super strong cases and screen protectors, but they actually have a number of other accessories and chargers as well for just about any device. I've been using OtterBox personally for more than a decade to protect my phone, and honestly, I refuse to have any other case on it. It has saved me so many times when I've dropped my phone onto a hard surface. And so it's really genuine that I'm recommending OtterBox to all of you. I mean, it's not just because there's an affiliate connection. Like I wouldn't recommend any other case, honestly. So if you go to ev-resource.com/deals and you scroll down to OtterBox, click on that link. That'll redirect you to their webpage, and make sure that you go with quality for protecting your mobile device. Okay, and with that, it is time to end this episode. But next episode, I actually have an interview with Alex Nigel, co-founder and CEO of Tenant, a company that is doing some amazing things to make EVs more accessible and more affordable for more people. I am super excited to share this one with you. And actually, towards the end of our conversation, I was moved to tears because of how mission-driven he and Tenant are. So this is absolutely one you do not want to miss. In fact, I'm going to do something a little special here. Here's a taste of what you can expect. And I'll let this little clip preview, if you will. I'll let that be the end of the episode. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Here's Alex. But I want to ask, what drives you in terms of when you get up in the morning? What is it that your first thoughts are really? What is your purpose of really pushing to accomplish what you're looking to do?
I think that's always something that's been part of my life. I just really want to make a difference. I think very early on in my life, I realized that reality is really just the realization of other people's dreams and visions. And the building exists because somebody wanted it to exist there. A company exists because an entrepreneur wanted that thing to exist and the universe to effectively shape according to their vision. And for me, there's obviously an aspect to I, as an individual, want to create a difference. And there's sort of as with any entrepreneur, a little bit of a narcissism aspect of that. But more importantly, I think there's just a drive that I observe where there's a strong correlation between energy consumption globally and socioeconomic wealth. The more we can make energy consumption bigger in a sustainable fashion, the better off the entire planet and ultimately people are. I'm not going to build rockets in space. I'm not going to build AI. I'm not going to build ultimately medical or healthcare innovation. All I can do is, can I create a system, financial innovation that helps energy production and consumption be more sustainable in every sense of the word? And my thesis is, and so far as corroborated by a lot of historical data, is society as a whole will be better off. So I've made that my personal mission statement.